Hello, and thank you for tuning in to Memo's Weekly Review with me, Nassim Ahmed, and my regular guest, Moin Robani. Hello, Moin, how are you doing?
Hi, Nassim. Always good to be with you.
So we were away for a week, myself and Moin, so we have a lot to catch up on, not least the events unfolding in Syria, but also developments from Gaza. There's a number of topics which we haven't been able to speak about because we missed the show last week. Both of us were actually in Doha, in the Doha Forum. And of course, developments, as I mentioned, in Syria and how that impacts the Palestinian issue. But let's begin, one, as I said, with just to get your thoughts and updates on events in Gaza. Israel has ramped up its mass killing and slaughter of Palestinians, starvation of Palestinians, and many would say that it's turned Gaza into a dystopian horror. We've passed another bleak milestone, which is that the death toll has surpassed 400,000. And the bits we forgot, we were unable to,
45,000.
sorry, 45,000. And the bits we were unable to speak about is the amnesty report, 290-page document concluding that Israel is committing genocide. And also, there was another report by the European Centre for Constitutional and Human Rights. That's an independent, non-profit legal education organization, ECCHR. They've also concluded that Israel is committing genocide. They've also carried out an extensive report on that. So just get your thoughts on that to begin with, not just those reports, but events in Gaza itself, where, as I mentioned, Israel has been bombing and killing Palestinians every day, of course, since 7 October, and more so now.
Hmm. Thank you, Nassim. Well, first of all, turning to the situation on the ground, it seems that with every passing day, Israel intensifies its war of annihilation, its war of eradication, really what's become a war of extermination against the Palestinians in the northern Gaza Strip, directly attacking hospitals, bombing residential buildings in the full knowledge that entire families are seeking shelter in them, deliberately wiping out entire families, and again in the northern Gaza Strip, in Beit Hanun, in Beit Lahia, in Jabalia town, Jabalia refugee camp, and some neighborhoods of Gaza City. And the plan has been publicly announced. To basically expel the entire population of the northern Gaza Strip southward, to treat any anything that moves within that area as a legitimate target, as a combatant, irrespective of their status, man, woman, or child, armed or unarmed, and then to systematically raise this entire region to the ground. And that's precisely what's been going on. There's been virtually no any supplies reaching that area. Hospitals are being directly targeted. Civil defense has, for all intents and purposes, ceased to exist. And where individuals, and we've seen videos of this, residents of these areas do attempt to come to the aid of Palestinians who are either trapped beneath the rubble or have been shot by Israeli snipers, they are then deliberately targeted. We've heard horrific stories of families um, stuck under the rubble for hours, for sometimes tens of hours, who then simply die because there is no civil defense. There are no more rescue services in the northern Gaza Strip. And I think what's telling is that the greater the intensification of this war of annihilation in the northern Gaza Strip, the more deafening the silence, the international silence about what Israel is doing there. So Israel, I think, justifiably believes that it has carte blanche to do anything it wants to whoever it wants, however it wants, whenever it wants, and it will enjoy, at worst, the passive acquiescence of its sponsors and allies in the West. It's, of course, absolutely catastrophic for the Palestinians. But having said that, while, of course, the civilian population of the Gaza Strip is undergoing absolutely horrific realities in the northern Gaza Strip, it seems that the armed movements there, Hamas, Jihad, and others, are still able to function and are still able to launch regular attacks against the invading Israeli forces and producing a steady stream of Israeli casualties. And this again raises a question of what is Israel's real target? Well, the Israelis have told us this is a war against the entirety of the northern Gaza Strip and not just the Palestinian armed groups who are based and operating there.
Mm. What's what I found interesting is how Netanyahu has been making victory speeches with events unfolding in Syria and, of course, with what's happened with Hezbollah. And there seems to be less and less focus on his initial war goals and the aims, which is to release the hostages. I mean, is Israel any closer to getting to that objective? Bearing in mind that this is the objective it set out in its annihilation of Palestinians in Gaza and expanded the war to Lebanon, to now Syria. We'll get to Syria later on, but generally he seems to be very proud of the fact that he's remaking the Middle East as he says it, but the hostages are no closer to being released.
Well, just to clarify, the release of Israel's captives and hostages in the Gaza Strip was not initially one of Israel's war aims. That was added later, primarily as a result of public pressure from within Israel and from foreign states who had citizens among the captives and hostages. Israel's initial war aims were to eliminate Hamas, basically to eradicate Hamas as a coherent military force and to eliminate Hamas as a governing authority in the Gaza Strip. Now, if those are if those were the enunciated goals in October of 2023, then one has to ask, why is Israel still engaging in such an intensive level of armed hostilities in December of 2024? No doubt Hamas has been weakened and degraded, significantly so. But the idea that Israel can somehow declare victory, even in the Gaza Strip, I think is a bit of a stretch. Yes, it has engaged in a genocide and gotten away with it. Yes, it has destroyed the Gaza Strip, reduced much of it to rubble, destroyed the civilian infrastructure, succeeded largely in its objective of making the Gaza Strip unfit for human habitation. But if you measure Israel's achievements in the Gaza Strip against its announced objectives, well, then the obvious question is, why is Israel still fighting against its weakest adversary in the smallest territory over a year after the most powerful military force in the Middle East unleashed this unprecedentedly intense military campaign?
Mm. There's been minor developments on the legal front as well. Well, one major diplomatic row, I should say, first of all, with Israel and Ireland. Israel has closed its embassy in Dublin, accusing Ireland of being anti-Israel. They didn't use the word anti-Semitic this time, but they said being anti-Israel. Ireland is supporting a petition in the ICJ accusing Israel of genocide. So, but other countries have also supported this petition. But why have they gone after Ireland? They haven't pulled or closed their embassies in, say, Cairo and some of the other European countries like Spain, for example. But they've decided to really go hard on Ireland.
Yes, and Israel's flunkies and apologists are somehow suggesting that Israel's withdrawal of its ambassador from Ireland is a beginning of the end of Ireland as a as a nation state. Actually, what Ireland did is something a little different. The Irish government announced that it would be making a submission to the International Court of Justice with respect to not just the South Africa versus Israel genocide case, but also the Gambia versus Myanmar genocide case. And what Ireland would be doing would be setting forth its view on how the Genocide Convention should be interpreted and applied. And the specific case that Ireland wants to raise is that the kind of siege tactics of deliberately withholding essential supplies from a civilian population should be considered relevant in any genocide case because they lead to conditions calculated to bring about the physical destruction of a protected group in whole or in part. Obviously, if Ireland succeeds in doing so, and the Irish government has said that it is motivated in part to do so by Ireland's own tragic history. I presume viewers are familiar with the potato famine and the horrific impact of British colonialism in Ireland, the world's oldest colony, lest we forget. If Ireland, with the moral and political weight it brings to this issue, succeeds in persuading the judges at the International Court of Justice that these kinds of actions by a state should be understood as directly relevant to any genocide case, that obviously makes things very difficult for Israel. And Israel has, and its flunkies have responded exactly as you would expect. You know, Ireland is the most anti-Semitic state in the world. Hitler was Irish, putting all kinds of anti-Irish racist tropes out. Um, uh, and the question that you ask, why Ireland and not the others? Well, Israel is not in a position to sever diplomatic relations with Egypt because it needs Egypt, because Egypt has been a dependable ally in its siege and blockade of the Gaza Strip. Egypt is the largest and most populous Arab state, and without Egypt's silence during the past year, would have been very difficult for Israel to continue with this genocide for as long as it has, as intensively as it has. And Ireland, I think, was seen by Israel as kind of a weak link, an easy target, a state with which it does not have many particularly important interests, and so it could transform Ireland into a bogeyman. I should say that it's arguably only in Ireland that a European center-right government would take the positions that it has on issues such as recognition of Palestinian statehood, making a submission to the International Court of Justice, support for the International Criminal Court, and so on. I mean, any other European center-right government would have stood solidly behind Israel on these issues. But Ireland, of course, given its unique history and direct experiences of many of the issues that we're discussing, is taking a different and more responsible position.
Yes, there's a lot of reasons to praise Ireland for that. Let's turn our attention to the wider regions. We'll be spending most of our discussion today speaking about the situation unfolding in Syria and how that impacts on the Palestinian issue. It's only probably 10 days ago, from what I read, the Biden administration was discussing with the UAE of lifting sanctions
I'm sorry to
against.
interrupt you, Nassim, but
Sorry.
did you also want to discuss the amnesty and ECCHR
I
report?
mean, if you want to make a point about amnesty, you can. I mean, it's a 290-page
Yeah.
report.
Well,
It
I
was
would just
published.
like to say a
Go on.
few quick points, if I might.
Sure, go for it.
Um, On the amnesty report, I mean, as you mentioned, it's a 290-page report. It's exceptionally thorough. And Amnesty does not make these kinds of charges lightly. In fact, does not make any charges against Israel lightly. So you can confidently dismiss, all the propaganda about, Amnesty being the human rights arm of Hamas and all the rest of it. There's been a controversy regarding this report, which is again meticulously argued and meticulously documented. And there's been a controversy about this because there was a genocide case before the International Court of Justice involving Croatia and Serbia, where the International Court of Justice essentially ruled that because the genocide or accusations of genocide took place in the context of an armed conflict, it was impossible to prove that the killings that were alleged to be perpetrated in the context of a genocide took place for no reason other than genocide, if you follow me. And the argument Amnesty is making is that it should be possible to infer and deduce a reality of genocide, even in the context of an armed conflict, because in an armed conflict, there are always going to be military objectives in addition to an objective of extermination. It's very solidly and meticulously argued, and it's an argumentation that has been supported by leading genocide scholars as not being in contradiction with the convention, but rather an attempt to interpret that convention in a more purposeful way. Now, what Israel and its apologists have done is to accuse Amnesty of seeking to rewrite the Genocide Convention and seeking to redefine the concept of genocide simply in order to vilify Israel, because, of course, the only reason anyone would ever criticize Israel is because there's jihadi, Nazi, anti Semites, and all the rest of it. Um, and what's interesting is that you now also have a second major European human rights organization, ECCHR, the European Center for Constitutional and Human Rights, if I'm not mistaken. It's actually a German organization
That's right.
that just came out with another very carefully argued report. And you can imagine how difficult it would have been for a German organization to get this position past its board and its staff and so on. And it too has now concluded that that we don't need to wait for a ruling from the International Court of Justice several years in the future, that based on the evidence we already have, we can already confidently make the determination that Israel is engaged in genocide. And if I can make just one more point, there's also another report. I'm sorry, but I forget the name of the organization put it out. It might be Air Wars or something like that. It's an organization that does very detailed analysis of casualties in armed conflict, and in fact has been relied on heavily, for example, by U.S. officials in other conflicts. And it looked only at the casualties during the first month of this, let's call it a conflict, October 2023, and reaches absolutely devastating conclusions that, the level of casualties, of civilian casualties, a proportion of women and children and so on, is really unprecedented in all the conflicts and bombing campaigns that this very credible organization has analyzed over the years. And then, to balance that, you have this report put out by the Henry Jackson Society, the lead author of whom is this charlatan named Andrew Fox, who describes himself as a disinformation researcher. He's actually a disinformation practitioner. And he twists and distorts all kinds of data and makes all kinds of ridiculous accusations about the data to try to demonstrate that in effect Israel, as some others still maintain, is the most moral army in the world. Um, Really has engaged in a meticulously discriminate campaign against combatants. That the only civilian casualties can legitimately be characterized as collateral damage, and that the information that these human rights organizations and others are basing their analysis on is basically because they've all been taken for a ride by Hamas, an absolutely shameless effort at genocide denial. And it's exactly what one would expect from the Henry Jackson Society. But of course, the Daily Telegraph in the UK has given it prominence and so on. While what's actually happening in the Gaza Strip, including the continued slaughter, a murder of journalists and reporters, and these much more credible and meticulously researched reports are basically treated as if they never happened or were never written.
Yeah, I mean, thanks for adding to what you said previously. I mean, we had a lot to get through, which is why I kind of skipped that part. But it's really important that you highlight the intervention by the Henry Jackson Society. It's a far right-wing, anti-Muslim outlet. And when I read the report, I mean, the conclusion it made was to dismiss the numbers of 45,000 Palestinians at least being killed. The argument it made was that, the only way Israel could have killed 45,000 Palestinians is if it targeted civilians. We have no evidence that Israel has done that.
Of
Therefore,
course
there's no
not.
way
Yeah.
there's no way Israel could have killed 45,000
Yeah.
people. It was kind of similar to the argument that Israel only kills Hamas, and if someone has been killed, obviously ipso facto he must have been Hamas. That's the
Exactly.
kind of logic.
Absolute charlatans.
Yeah. Yeah, let's return to the situation in Syria. As I mentioned, just a few weeks ago, the U.S. administration was working with the UAE in thinking about lifting sanctions against Syria. Assad went to the Riyadh summit, so there's a sense that Assad was being reintegrated into the region. So all of a sudden, no one expected. So, I mean, what are your initial thoughts of how quickly, how swiftly HTS and the Syrian opposition forces and fighters managed to galvanize, coalesce, and bring about what to Syrians is a huge, huge victory?
Well, it was certainly unexpected. Not only the collapse of the Syrian military and ultimately the Syrian regime, but also the rapidity with which it was achieved. And I think the first question we need to ask, because there are so many unanswered questions, is whether those who launched the offensive and on the 27th of November, launched it as a campaign to reach Damascus and overthrow the government, or rather that they had more limited objectives. But once they began pursuing those, the entire edifice collapsed like a house of cards, and they found an open road between them and would have been before them, and simply advanced on that basis. So that I think is the first point. That of course those who are now sitting in Damascus are informing us that this had been their plan all along, and it had been intended as a campaign to seize the Syrian capital and overthrow the Syrian regime and so on. I'm not so sure. I think there's quite a lot of evidence that it was planned and initiated as a more limited campaign that then expanded as the opportunity arose, because we quickly discovered the Syrian army had zero morale left. It had absolutely no will to fight. and the government, the regime simply imploded and disintegrated. So that would be my first point. Um, Second point is, this is being presented as effectively a campaign by Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS, which of course did play a leading role in these events, but it appears and is now the dominant power in Damascus. But while they did conduct the main efforts in the north, particularly in Aleppo and then Hama, it appears that the main offensive against Damascus was actually initiated by rebel groups based in Syria's south, including former rebel groups who Russia had been seeking to persuade the government in Damascus to integrate into its ranks as part of a reconciliation process. And so this again raises all kinds of questions about the various roles played by Turkey, by Iran, by Russia, and by others in essentially recognizing that the status quo had become untenable and what, if any, arrangements they made to seek to accommodate each other for the new phase.
Um, What do you make of the fact that there are reports that HTS has been funded by CIA, Israel, or at least backed them in some shape or form, and it's simply not the case that their objective of deposing, toppling Assad merely happens to align with Israel and the Americans' objective also wanting to topple Assad? I'm saying this because, I mean, there's been a massive fallout since then, which we'll get to, between those who, even within the pro-Palestinian camp, those who say, we need to preserve the so-called axis of resistance, Iran, Syria, Hezbollah, Lebanon,
Mhm.
and those who say, no, the Arab populations in the Middle East have to be freed from their tyrants. That also is also a form of resistance. And any country that kills its own population to 500,000, 500,000 or so in the case of Syria, and displaces half of its population, has lost all right to govern. So there is that camp as well. But we'll get to that's part of my question later on. But what do you make of generally of the fact that there are reports out there that the CIA and Israel has backed HTS, and it's not simply the case that their goals of toppling Assad simply aligns. There is something deeper than that.
Yeah, again, these are, I think, difficult questions to answer confidently. We know, for example, that the main sponsor of the HTS offensive that took place and ended up with the overthrow of the Syrian regime, the main sponsor was in fact Turkey. And we know that Turkey maintains close relations with the United States and despite the public hostility between them, also informal relations with Israel. We know for a fact that the United States was one of the main sponsors of various Syrian rebel groups in Syria, and in fact is in physical occupation of a substantial portion of Syrian territory, primarily the area east of the Euphrates River, and controls, for example, Syria's oil wells, from which Syria pre-war derived some 40% of its revenue and was a main area also of wheat production and so on. And we know that Israel has also developed relations with various rebel groups, primarily further to the south along the front near the occupied Golan Heights, and has provided, for example, medical treatment and in some cases also weapons to Syrian rebel groups. And at one point, I believe, about a decade ago, either an Al Qaeda or ISIS group fired a missile at Israel and then apologized for it, if my memory serves me correctly. I think the key issue here is that it's fair to say that until quite recently, all these states and governments you're talking about, Israel, the United States, and others, preferred a weak central government in Damascus to a kind of fragmented Syria. And what appears to have happened in recent months, certainly with respect to Israel, I'm less clear about whether this was also an agenda shared by the United States, is a belief that in order to achieve Israel's objectives in the Middle East, Israel would be better off without the Syrian regime. In other words, a fragmented Syria, different parts of which would be run by different groups, kind of the way Lebanon was governed during the Civil War, seemed to have emerged as a preferred Israeli scenario in comparison to the previous one, which was that a weak Assad in power in Damascus was Israel's preferred scenario. Now, does that imply cause and effect? Not necessarily. That may, um, if we agree that that was Israel's preferred outcome, what evidence do we have that Israel actually actively intervened to make this happen? Well, the main evidence we have concerns the role of Turkey rather than the role of Israel. So I would be quite hesitant, certainly, to put this down to any kind of grand CIA Mossad plot to engineer regime change in Damascus. I mean, we have to, I think, also understand that yes, there is foreign intervention. There's actually a huge amount of foreign intervention, but none of what we're seeing could have been possible without Syrian actors playing a primary role and without Syrian agendas playing an important role in what happened. So I think, when we talk about the roles of these various countries. In the absence of concrete evidence, I think we also have to consider the prospects of opportunism, in other words, of taking advantages of developing realities rather than necessarily being the parties that instigated them or produced them.
Well, at least we can say for sure what Israel doesn't want is a Syrian state which is strongly backing the Palestinian cause. And if it cannot achieve that, then at least have a Syrian state that is too embroiled in its own domestic affairs to be engaged in pro support for the
Yes.
Palestinian issue.
Yes,
Um,
and if I can just interject on this point, I mean, what we've seen Israel do in Syria since the 8th of December, it has carried out what, according to Israeli sources, is the largest military campaign in Israeli history. And the purpose of which, of course, on the pretext of dealing with potential threats and preventing, Syria's arsenal of tens of thousands of nuclear weapons from falling into the hands of ISIS and all the rest of this uh, bogus things, conducted a systematic campaign to eradicate, to eliminate Syria's military infrastructure. It has basically bombed anything and everything that can be even remotely considered as Syrian military capabilities. And, airfields, military bases, weapons depots, harbors, the works, anything and everything that can be identified with the Syrian military has been, to the extent that Israel has been able to do so, destroyed. So this is a direct attack on the Syrian state. Certainly not an attack on the Assad regime, which no longer exists. Um, and yesterday and on Sunday, bombings in Tartus on the Syrian coast were so intensive that they registered 3.5 on the Richter scale, just to give you an idea of what's going on. Now, part of this, of course, is to ensure that any new regime well, first of all, to ensure that Syria has no military capabilities. Second, to ensure that it will be virtually impossible for a strong central government to emerge in Damascus that can impose its authority on the entire country, particularly given all the various rivalries and agendas among various groups. But I think it also should be understood as a premeditated, deliberate effort to promote the idea of fragmentation in Syria. Again, along the lines of what we saw in Lebanon during the 1970s and the 1980s. And what is quite telling here is that those now who are most powerful in Damascus are almost looking the other way and pretending none of this has happened. I mean, the HTS leader, who used to go by the nom de guerre of Jolani in reference to the occupied Syrian Golan Heights, no longer uses that name. I think he has yet to say the word Israel in
Yeah,
reference
that is
to
a
these developments. Um,
that is
and
a fair point. But can I just
yes,
get to a point you made earlier about the level of bombing that Israel has carried out in Syria, the weapons depot and destruction of, well, making sure that whatever comes after has no ability to threaten Israel in any shape or form with missiles and whatnot. That being the case, some may ask, Assad is presented as this actor within the axis of resistance. Why didn't Assad use those weapons to support the Palestinian cause? And if anything, Assad, as many have argued and pointed out, Assad just throughout the so-called war on terror decades from 2001 onwards, he was seen as the favorite dictator of Washington for extraordinary rendition, where anyone
one
America
of.
want one of yes, America, if America wanted someone disappeared or tortured, they send them to Assad. So Assad
Well, there's
was
a well-known case, for example, of Maher al-Arrar, who was sent there and later received compensation for this from the Canadian authorities and others.
Yeah, so the question I'm trying to get to is, so Assad is presented as this figure of being part of the acts of resistance, but he's not really been resisting the Israelis and supporting the Palestinians in the way many make out. If anything, he has been a cog within the US agenda in the region, especially after the war on terror. So should we see the Assad regime in that kind of rosy eyes, especially with regards to the Palestinian issue and being part of this axis of resistance? I don't think history shows that, does it?
Well, it should be no revelation that Syria's priority has always been Syria's national interest. The question then becomes is how Syria interpreted that and pursued that national interest, and it did so in various ways. On the one hand, it gave, for example, particularly after during and after the 1990s a very high level of support to Hezbollah in Lebanon and allowed its territory to be used as a resupply route to Hezbollah for advanced weaponry from Iran. And in fact, most of Hezbollah's weapons came from Syria rather than from Iran. Syria hosted the exiled leadership of Hamas after it was expelled from Jordan in 2000. Um, Syria believed that its national interests lay not in becoming part of the coalition of conservative Arab states that are aligned with the West, but rather in being more closely aligned with Iran, particularly with Russia and with others who sought to limit Israeli and Western influence in the Middle East, and it did so in pursuance of what it understood to be Syrian national security and Syrian national interests. So, I you know I don't think it's a simple answer of did Israel, sorry, rather did Syria support or oppose the Palestinians. Syria was consistent in its support of Syria as it understood this. And in some contexts, that was very beneficial to the Palestinians. In other contexts, it was very detrimental to the Palestinians. But I think the thing that we need to understand here is that Syria was part of a coalition that most Palestinians, irrespective of their views of the Assad regime, which on the whole I think were probably very negative, particularly those who had personal experience with it, um, saw as part of a regional coalition that, unlike its regional rivals, was at least formally committed to Palestinian national goals and was at least capable of acting on the basis of that commitment. I mean, how many Palestinian training camps did you have in Jordan, or Egypt, or Saudi Arabia? Well, precisely zero. So it's a complex it's a complex issue. I mean, we can go back in history and speak, for example, of Syria's role in 1976 in preventing a Lebanese national movement, Palestinian victory in the Lebanese Civil War, and its role in fomenting a mutiny against Yasser Arafat and the PLO leadership in 1983, and so on. But I think, the way to answer this question is to understand that Syria, as a state, as any other state, always placed its own interests as it understood them first, and it just so happened that in many cases this worked to the Palestinian advantage, particularly how Syria's strategic positioning regionally and internationally. The question now becomes is how will Syria's new rulers look at this issue? Well, the initial signs are not good. They've called on Palestinians to close down their training camps and so on. They're basically pretending the Golan Heights isn't occupied and that Israel's further occupations of Syrian territory are somehow not happening. But over time, I think it will become impossible. It will become impossible for the Syrian leadership to ignore these issues. And if they continue to ignore them, I think they will face strong pressure from within their rank and file not to ignore these issues. And should it come to a situation in which Syria is not entirely subdued, and basically transformed into an Israeli vassal state like some of its neighbors. Um, I think just as pre-Ba'ath, Syria was known for its strong support of the Palestinians, may well become again. And I should just add another issue, quite apart from the politics, is that no Arab state has given Palestinians the same rights that Syria has. Yes, Jordan gave them citizenship or imposed citizenship on many of them. But in Syria, Palestinians, and already well before the Ba'ath seized power in 1963, Palestinians enjoyed, for all intents and purposes, full equality, had access to all the same rights as Syrian citizens, or lack of rights more recently. The only exceptions being that Palestinians could not serve in cabinet positions or become head of state. And bearing in mind that Palestinians in Syria are not Syrian citizens, they are refugees. Nevertheless, Syria gave Palestinian refugees rights that would be the envy of any refugee community in any Western country.
Yeah, it's hard to predict what's going to transpire? I mean, can Syria remain a sovereign entity? I mean, it looks very unlikely at the moment, and the litmus test for the new Syria is, will it be a democracy? What kind of government will it have? I wanted to quote you something that goes beyond state actors and parties, but generally looking at the region and expressing what is the main threat posing Israel. And in this case, it is Arab democracy. So this is a Syrian expert, and he says that it's important to remember that with the fall of Assad and the crippling of Iran's resistance axis, for the US's Middle East partners, the key existential threat remains the same, which is Arab democracy. So if you were to speculate and say, okay, if Syria can become a democracy, expressing the wishes of its population, representing its population, then that ultimately is a threat to Israel. And likewise, if any other Arab country was to really reflect the wishes of its population, over 90%, 99% in some countries, they would want a hostile stance towards Israel. So Syria can potentially, with many things falling into alignment, could potentially be an example of other Arab countries where it is reflecting the wishes of its population and becomes a major threat to Israel. I mean, that's
Yes, I mean, I think first, let me just say, I think what Syria needs first and foremost during this stage is not democracy in terms of elections and electing a new government and all the rest of it. It needs pluralism. After decades as a one-party state, I think Syria needs a period in which new political movements and parties and organizations and so on are allowed to emerge and develop freely and so on. And I think only then should power be contested in a plebiscite, because we already saw in Egypt in 2011, 2012, for example, when you rush towards elections, you don't need to hold elections to figure out who's going to win, because there's only one party that has a machinery built over decades to successfully contest those elections. We saw that to an extent in Tunisia as well. And so what I think is primarily needed and desperately needed is a transitional period of pluralism, of allowing new parties, new movements, new newspapers, new broadcasters, and so on to emerge, so that if and when Syrians do go to the ballot box, they have a genuine choice. Um, Now, regarding what you said, it's perfectly true that Israel and the United States, for that matter, have always understood that the most hostile to Israel are going to be those governments who most represent the will of their citizens and the views of their citizens. And in the case of Syria, it's not just about Palestine. Yes, Syrians have very deeply rooted views on Palestine, bearing in mind that Palestine, Jordan, and Lebanon, and so on, have historically been part of what's known as Bilad al-Sham, Greater Syria. But for Syria, there's also the other issue that Israel is not just occupying Palestinian territory, it's occupying Syrian territory since 1967. And in the last week, it has occupied significantly more of it than it has for the past 50 years. It's basically shredded the 1974 disengagement agreement. So, you know, even if Palestinians were not part of this equation, Syrians have plenty of reasons of their own for seeking, a confrontation with Israel, particularly given what Israel has done in and against Syria during the past week. But to get back to your point, yes, it's an axiom, that when and where Arabs are allowed to freely express their views on this issue, it's crystal clear. And I think part of Israel's problems is that's also becoming increasingly the case in Western societies, which was never the case before.
Yeah, and let's Ed, with this final question on Netanyahu, I mean, he's been gloating, he's been in triumphant mood. He's saying that I've changed the face of the Middle East. And as you mentioned, they've moved into parts of Syria, occupying more Syrian land. There's a buffer zone to protect the Golan Heights, which is also a buffer zone. So a buffer zone to protect the buffer zone. And Israel has never really failed to seize on an opportunity to seize more territory. That's always been the case. But do you think, I mean, he should be as triumphant as he's making out, or is this some kind of just a false Pyrrhic victory, delaying the inevitable? But because ultimately, when it comes to the Palestinian issue, the underlying causes of unrest and conflict with the Israelis still there. He's not pushed the needle any far forward when it comes to the Palestinian issue. All he's done is moved the scene of war and conflict to another terrain. But the Palestinian issue still remains at the core, and he's not done anything on that front.
Well, I think Netanyahu is certainly acting very triumphant. And if you look at it on the face of it, given recent developments in Palestine, in the West Bank, where the PA is now invading refugee camps in the northern West Bank on Israel's behalf, in Lebanon, where Hezbollah has been weakened, in Syria, where there's a very real likelihood that the transition will involve a considerable period of chaos and fragmentation. You can see why Netanyahu and Israel are acting so triumphantly, but triumphalism is often premature. And I think, when I think Israel is seeking to achieve several things here. We've talked about Israel's agenda in Syria, but there's also another key issue that we shouldn't overlook, which is that from the beginnings of the Zionist movement, Zionist leaders and later Israeli leaders have tried to present themselves as reliable proxies for Western power in the Middle East. Herzl referred to a Jewish state in Palestine as an outpost of civilization against barbarism. Ehud Barak referred to Israel as the villa in the jungle. And Netanyahu basically is claiming he's saving Western civilization from imminent destruction. Well, that whole framework was very severely challenged on October 7th and its aftermath. I mean, Israel's vaunted military and intelligence services collapsed like a house of cards. Israel, for the first time since 1949, was forced to fight on its own territory and so on. And Israel, that was supposed to be the proxy, all of a sudden, its axiom that we defend ourselves by ourselves evaporated. And it became clear how extraordinarily dependent Israel is on its Western sponsors and allies, chiefly the United States. That's begun to change in the past few months, where Israel managed to weaken Hezbollah in Iran, where now there's been regime change in Syria, and Israel can once again present itself as having been a key factor in a strategic transformation of an entire region, and thereby once again seek to regain the trust and confidence of its sponsors and allies in the West as a powerful, reliable, dependable proxy. And we're now hearing Netanyahu again make noises about imminent freedom in Iran. So I wouldn't at all be surprised if Israel now, for example, ramps up its attacks on Yemen and potentially seeks to launch a devastating attack on Iran, either to get this off its list before Trump takes office in January 20th, or in order to confront Trump with the situation as he enters office, where the United States is already implicated in an Iranian Israeli conflict. So I think you know, um, Israel's regional role and how it's trying to reestablish that should also not be discounted in looking at these questions.
We will be returning to many of those themes
Yes.
in the coming weeks, Moin. We've run out of time, I guess, and I want to thank you. That was my guest, Moin Robani, joining me,
you.
Nassim Ahmed, for our Weekly Review show. Thank you for joining us. Bye-bye.